Hello everyone, this is AndresRestart, and today we are talking about what I would say is some pretty exciting The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time remake news here. Because we got a little bit of something from Nintendo that I think has some massive, exciting implications, and that's definitely going to be the focus for today's video. But I also want to touch a little bit upon some news we got from a few days ago regarding this supposed GameStop leak that I already talked about. There are some updates to this that I find interesting, and perhaps a new rumor that might be coinciding with this information that also makes things very curious. Perhaps this is all leading to an Ocarina of Time remake Nintendo Direct fairly soon, maybe not, hard to say. Regardless though, we do have some new information from Nintendo that I do think has some pretty interesting, and I mean it, exciting implications about this game, and so that's what we're going to be diving into today. Now before going forward, let me point out I'm getting so close to my goal of 60,000 subscribers, so if you find yourself enjoying my videos and you haven't subscribed already, well, I would appreciate you subscribing. So before getting into the new stuff from Nintendo, let's go back to a story talked about from a few days ago. From a few days ago, people noticed that GameStop had a listing for The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. As it reads here, buy The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time Nintendo Switch 2 at GameStop. This item is currently not available. 8/4/2026 pre-order. Now, something that I didn't point out last time, there is a little bit of an ellipses here, so there's some information in between, but the suggestion here from the details here on this search is that the Ocarina of Time remake will be put up for pre-order at GameStop on August 4th. And this would be a huge deal because if there are going to be pre-orders opening up on August 4th at GameStop, it implies that there's going to be significant new information that will be revealed, if not on the 4th, right before it. And so that might mean something like a new trailer, some sort of presentation, perhaps even a Ocarina of Time dedicated Nintendo Direct, and that would be exciting so we could learn more about this game and get a better picture, a better understanding of what this is all about. Now, what was interesting is that GameStop changed the listing, or it was changed somehow, and now it doesn't say any of that information. But what makes things more interesting, or perhaps confusing, I guess other people are covering something else from this. I had not seen this when I made my own response video to this information here, because you see that Nate the Hate did something to kind of shut down all the excitement about this, because Nate the Hate posted this: no, GameStop didn't leak the pre-order date nor the price for The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. For whatever reason, Google is pulling the release date and pricing information for Beast of Reincarnation, which releases on August 4th and Standard Editions retails for $59.99. Now, as you see here, what he is sharing is a different image than the image I was talking about. It's not the same image, it's not the same information, it's not the same implications outside of a pre-order date thing. But what Nate the Hate covered here, you see it says new games, Beast of Reincarnation, Xbox Series X, available on PS5, Xbox Series, blah blah blah, $59.99, release date August 4th. So like this, all this detail stuff here is not at all the same for the stuff I covered on this post right here. So I feel like, you know, it's kind of funny. People are saying, oh, you didn't even read this. Of course this was read. Now, regardless, this information here has been changed. And while I think it could mean something, assuming it's not just some random AI stuff as Nate the Hate's trying to imply with this completely different image, because it's listed by GameStop, there's no guarantee it actually means for sure something is happening. Like, there is room for error, as we discussed in the prior video. However, it does get me somewhat optimistic that maybe something could be happening soon here, when also just thinking about that The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time probably does deserve its own sort of presentation. I think the idea of waiting until September for another general direct where they'll talk about other things, including probably other Zelda 40th anniversary announcements and a live-action Zelda movie, us just getting one more trailer for the Ocarina of Time remake with all this other Zelda stuff and other Nintendo information and third-party stuff all in one presentation, like, yeah, they could do that, but this is going to be Nintendo's biggest game of the year, and considering how many game-dedicated directs we've gotten from Nintendo, the more and more I think about it, the more and more I think they probably do want to, at some point, have a dedicated presentation just focusing on the Ocarina of Time remake and really telling us what this game is about, because it is their biggest release for the year, and perhaps by a substantial margin. And so the idea of there being a bigger presentation of some kind regarding this game in early August makes sense from that perspective, but also because there are a variety of events that are happening later on such as in late August and all throughout September, and you might think Nintendo would want to have their own focused message on this first before there's a whole bunch of different people going out to play Nintendo's most anticipated title, their biggest release for the holidays this year. So I do think it makes sense, and if there is something to this GameStop listing, well, yeah. If there's a presentation early August, maybe that's what would happen. But when you have people like Nate the Hate, even though I think this image here doesn't really match up to what I was talking about, when you have people like them who have a lot of inside information that may have a good understanding of when they will actually talk about this game, I do think it's more reason to take this idea with a grain of salt, to be more skeptical. Maybe it's nothing because, again, it's GameStop. Mistakes happen. However, someone else who in the past has heard about Zelda things, has had contacts of some sorts, and has made different hints, including Once Upon a Time Ocarina of Time HD, which might be what this Ocarina of Time remake has become after many years, has said something on Twitter. So on July 17th, a few days ago, probably when people were freaking about this GameStop stuff, Game Over Jesse said 2 weeks. And it may have just had to do with him thinking that pre-orders are going to open up and there would be some sort of new information about the game. Maybe. However, days afterwards, he still says, I legitimately can't wait. And we look at the thread, Nintendo Prime's like questioning, what do you mean? Well, he just put a question mark, but you know. And here, Game Over Jesse just says, hello chat, with a GIF. And then this person here says, wow, with another GIF. And Game Over Jesse just puts, this is fine, sort of meme thing, but with link. And then Game Over Jesse does it again here with this hello chat thing. So, like, he's definitely being weird and cryptic. He's implying that something's happening in 2 weeks, which, by the way, if you check your calendars, is right around the time of August 4th, which supposedly, according to this initial GameStop thing, is when Ocarina of Time Remake pre-orders would open up. Still, be skeptical. Again, Game Over Jesse doesn't necessarily know everything. They may not even be getting at that. They could just be excited because maybe they didn't see what Nate the Hate said, or they just don't blindly believe them, so they still think that maybe something could be happening by August 4th. Or it has nothing to do with Ocarina of Time news, which seems unlikely given what they're getting at here. But maybe it's just Game Over Jesse coming back to his YouTube channel and doing something with that. It's possible. Grains of salt. That all said, we do have something from Nintendo that has some pretty big implications, I would say. So let's now dive into that. As we see here shared by Genki, the Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time Remake page in the Nintendo Summer Catalog. The Nintendo Summer Catalog, it's official. Slogan, when translated, Reborn Across Time. This is a big deal. For several reasons, I would say. Firstly, Nintendo has repeatedly and consistently used the word Reborn when marketing this game. And I think this is actually a really, really big clue. I understand some people are probably going to say, oh, well, one time they tweeted about Skyward Sword HD and they said Reborn in that tweet, and they also did it for Star Fox recently. Sure, that's true. But the point here is the consistency, the frequency. Because yeah, you can have some sort of person working behind Nintendo's social media marketing here, and they might have an idea to use a cool wording to excite people where they'll say, oh, this game is in Reborn for whatever. But when the messaging is consistent across all the different forms of marketing of a particular game, then it's something bigger. It's not just coming from one person who had an idea for a good tweet, but it's coming from the actual messaging that the team behind this has decided would be meaningful messaging about this game. So when Nintendo talked about this teaser in Nintendo Direct, they used the term Reborn. That was the wording they used in the Direct. When they had the follow-up tweet on Twitter, yes, they used Reborn in that really big tweet that everyone freaked out about. On Nintendo's own website, when we checked the metadata before they changed it after everyone sort of discovered it and started freaking out, they were describing it as a rebirth, a reborn, a full remake they also used within that information. All of that's been changed. They still do have the Reborn part though. And now we're seeing this, which is clearly marketing Ocarina of Time Remake, and they are saying Reborn Across Time. And so, yes, the point here is that Nintendo is continually, consistently, frequently, every time they are marketing or providing messaging about this game, they're not even describing it as a remake, actually. The only time they've mentioned remake is within the metadata, which wasn't necessarily meant to be public information, which was taken down. What they have been saying is Reborn. And I think this is really important when thinking about how Nintendo does provide messaging for their games. They like to be upfront about this stuff. They do not like to raise expectations if those expectations are not good expectations to have. Think about how whenever Nintendo does have some sort of presentation, a Nintendo Direct, they're always like, hey, we're just focusing on this stuff. That's what it's about. Or they'll even have like a movie Direct and they'll still say there will be no game information in this Direct, which seems like common sense. But Nintendo is still very careful about that messaging. When they revealed Star Fox in its own Direct, they made sure to tell us that it's a remake pretty early on. They did not try to argue it's like a reimagining or something like that. They're like, hey, this is a remake, a one-to-one remake with the campaign. They're upfront about this information. They're not trying to mislead, manipulate. That's not the point. That's not how they operate here. They try to keep expectations in check. Now, keeping expectations in check, I feel like some people might misconstrue that to mean don't be excited about things. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is where they should be. And where they should be, in the case of Ocarina of Time Remake, I think is actually a really huge big deal, because guess what? It's Nintendo's biggest game of the year. It's going to be their big seller. It's going to be the thing that pushes Switch 2 sales more than anything else. So what that does mean, keeping expectations in check here, it goes both ways. This is something to be very excited about. This is not being treated as just a typical remake. This is being treated as something bigger. Nintendo's marketing, their messaging, has not been remake, it has been Reborn. So I think we should be keeping that in mind. What does that suggest about this game? Some people might still argue it's just Nintendo trying to hype things up. It doesn't really mean anything more than that. I disagree. For the reasons I just explained, they're very intentional with their messaging. It's one thing if it just happens once on a random Twitter post, but when it's consistent across the board in every form they provide messaging about this game, it's very different. So I do think the term Reborn Across Time has a lot of implication. Because that's the other thing here. It's not just about Reborn. Now we have this new slogan, Reborn Across Time. Some might just think that's just really cool wording because the game's been reborn across time now many years later, and because Ocarina of Time has to do with time travel, it's just a cool play on words. But when talking about the word reborn itself, as we've discussed in the past, the implication here is that the game is not only being remade, but something beyond that. It's going to have reimagined elements. And what's interesting, when we look at the literal teaser trailer itself, we see a lot of elements that have been reimagined. We can see the tapestry, and within it we can see the design of the Deku Tree, which is vastly different than any other iteration we've seen of the Deku Tree before. We look at the footage with Link in his house. The structure of the house, completely different. Doesn't look like anything of the house we've seen before. Link himself, his design is different. His clothes are different. There's layers there. There's leaves being woven in. His hat, which we see off to the side hanging off his bed, is also different from any other version of Link's hat we've seen before. So we are seeing structural changes here. We are seeing design changes here. And while this teaser trailer is very minimal and only showing us a very little bit about this game, what's clear when you actually think about what's been shown, we're seeing significant redesigns here. Reimagined elements here, a lot of it, all of it. So I think that kind of serves a point when thinking about how Nintendo's describing this as the game being reborn. And if they are going to this extent to reimagine elements, including the literal structure of the environments in the case of the room, and also in the case of the Deku Tree, if he has a big redesign, that means he's probably going to be structurally different as well, because guess what? He's a dungeon. You literally go inside of him, and that's a whole dungeon there. And so that may even mean we're talking about just the level structure, the world structure, the dungeons themselves being different, not the same structurally. But we've covered this point before. The across time element, let's try and dig a little bit deeper on that. The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, it's literally within the title, has to do with time travel. We know that Ocarina of Time is the game that creates the three-way timeline split for the entire sort of Zelda timeline. However, at the end of the game, where the timeline split is created, you can easily understand how two timelines would be created, but the third, maybe something should be done there in this remake or rebirth that would give us a better indication of that. But if they are going to be reimagining elements in this game, I think it could go beyond that. Because I would argue that the time travel elements in Ocarina of Time, they're there, but when thinking about how this game was made back in 1998, there was only so much that could be done on the N64. This was the first 3D Zelda. There was a lot to figure out with that. In today's era, many years later, where technology has significantly improved and developers have figured out so many different other ways to make third-person action-adventure games, and Zelda itself has evolved significantly, and this game would be getting a rebirth to match up to the modern Zelda standard, which, by the way, this is the first big new Zelda Switch 2 title, a new generation, which would even be something beyond what we've seen for Breath and Tears in a lot of ways. There's a lot of reason to think there's much work that will be done here. And so what I'm getting at is maybe we're going to be talking about some new time travel elements here. If that's a part of Nintendo's messaging, I think that would be really interesting. Now, what do I mean when talking about having more time travel involved? Well, you go back and forth to the past and the future when you go into the Temple of Time. But if they're going to be expanding upon the gameplay here, perhaps they could come up with more elements that take advantage of this time travel stuff. Maybe making Child Link a little bit more relevant throughout the adult part of the timeline, for example. Or perhaps even redoing some dungeons where more time travel is required. You think about what Nintendo did with Skyward Sword and the Time Shift Stones. There are some really cool time travel mechanics with that, and I think that kind of serves my point. Skyward Sword came out in 2011, which by this point, kind of an old game, but still many years more modern than Ocarina of Time. But that sort of goes to show they can do a lot more with dungeons and the puzzles involved regarding time travel, and they could probably do even more now many years later. So I wouldn't be surprised if we're going to be seeing more time travel puzzles and such embedded into this new version of Ocarina of Time. One more thing I would like to consider here before closing out is just how, with the teaser trailer, it's not being told in the same way as the very beginning of Ocarina of Time. Like, a lot of it is, and I do think there's a strong chance this teaser trailer is basically just kind of showing us the beginning of the game. But there are some changed elements. The biggest one I noticed is that this is no longer being told from the perspective of the Deku Tree, but another person, another party. I theorize that it perhaps could be Rauru. Hard to say for sure. Also, some might consider that this is not even actually the true beginning of the game, but just like something they put together for marketing purposes, which I disagree with because this is usually not how Nintendo shows their trailers. Usually they will actually just share with you something from actually the game, and considering that this game is coming out later this year, I don't think like this is something that's from far off early into development that whatever we're seeing here is going to be changed by the time the game actually comes out. But something about this teaser that has thrown me off a little bit, that has maybe questioned if I'm on the money or not regarding this being the beginning of the actual game, is how there's a narrator saying long ago. But I've been taking a look at some of the different Zelda games, including like Majora's Mask, for example, and I noticed that the way they introduced the beginning of the game, it is describing an event that is transpiring from a third-person perspective that isn't actually involved with this legend, with this tale, with this story, with these events. And so considering the teaser trailer and how there's this narrator saying long ago, I think it's very similar. So it's actually very much in line with typical Zelda. It's kind of like retelling this legend, the Legend of Zelda. That's kind of the idea. We're sort of getting into this, and the understanding is that we are going to experience a legend. And this time, we're seeing this legend reborn across time. And so ultimately what I'm getting at here, when considering the slogan, Reborn Across Time, there is a greater understanding of the history of things here when it comes to Zelda and time travel, and the idea that the narrator for the beginning of the game is retelling a legend from long ago, that might fit in here. And I'll point something else out that some might find interesting, because we theorize that perhaps the narrator is Rauru. Well, Rauru is in the Chamber of Sages. Rauru seems to have been around for many generations, beyond the typical lifespan of one human, and perhaps being in the Chamber of Sages, it's almost kind of like being in a state of suspended time. That's an idea. In other words, the idea that Rauru could still be the one narrating here and telling us about the legend of the Hero of Time actually might be pretty plausible. That is, of course, my speculation. Regardless, the messaging regarding Ocarina of Time Remake is a rebirth, a reborn. Nintendo continues to focus on this part of the messaging here. That's very exciting to me. To me, that gives me very strong confidence that this is more than just a typical remake. I think this is something that's going to be something worthy of being considered the biggest, best Switch 2 title this year. But what do you all think? Let me know in the comments below. This is AndresRestart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I will see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.